U.S. President Donald Trump is holding a cabinet meeting at the White House. The war with Iran is likely to be high on the agenda. Trump told reporters at the meeting that Iran wants a deal to end the war, but that the U.S. is not yet satisfied with the terms. It's still far from clear what those terms actually are. Iranian state TV says the latest proposal foresees the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz in return for the U.S. lifting its naval blockade. But the White House says that's, quote, a complete fabrication. And let's bring in White House correspondent Janelle Dumalaon with more. So what is happening at the White House right now, Janelle?
Well, Sarah, as you said, President Trump held a cabinet meeting. He started speaking at around noon Eastern time and ended the cabinet meeting at around an hour and a quarter later. Now, as has become customary with these cabinet meetings, he jumped from topic to topic. He talked about the Texas state elections. He talked about drug prices. But of course, the dominant issue, as you said, is of course Iran and the murky state of play around that memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and Iran. And now that the cabinet meeting is over, there is very little to indicate that very much has moved since he started speaking. We heard much of the same things that he had said before. He has said that Iran very much wants to make a deal and that they are, quote, negotiating on fumes. He said, we can make a good deal right now, but not a great deal. And if it's not a great deal, I don't want to make it. He said that the Strait of Hormuz will open immediately, but it has to be, quote, perfect. All that to say, it looks like there is still a lot that is up in the air when it comes to this framework deal, which, reminding our viewers once again, isn't the final deal to end the conflict between the U.S. and Iran or the deal to get Iran to give up making a nuclear weapon. Rather, this is the framework deal, so the framework around which a final deal could be made. So that's why they're calling it a memorandum of understanding. These are the talks before the talks.
And Janelle, I mean, let's look at some of the details here, because Iranian state TV, for its part, it says that it's received a draft of the U.S. proposal that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz while the U.S. would lift its naval blockade. The U.S. is calling that a complete fabrication. So what is going on here?
Exactly. And here it might be worth reading the statement of the administration that they posted on X. This report from Iranian-controlled media is not true. The MOU they released is a complete fabrication. Nobody should believe what Iranian state media is putting out. Facts matter. So what we see here is the administration categorically denying what the Iranian state media has said. But when Trump was asked about the negotiations of the Strait of Hormuz, he said, the strait's going to be open for everybody. Nobody's going to control it. We'll watch over it. Now, while Trump is denying what this Iranian state media has reported, he didn't exactly use his cabinet meeting to clarify what is indeed in the negotiations in a more detailed manner, nor did he say what kind of impact this sort of public divergence between the U.S. side and the Iranian side could potentially have on the negotiations. But we did get the broad strokes again of the posture that he is trying to assume, that he says he's not in a hurry, that the Iranians are more desperate for a deal, that he's not worried about this casting a shadow over the midterm elections. But beyond all that posturing, it is undeniable that he is under a lot of pressure to find a way out of this.
Janelle, he opened his cabinet meeting saying, and I'm quoting here, things are going very well. But I mean, Trump is under a lot of pressure to get a deal done and quickly. What dynamics are at play domestically there in the United States?
You know, there are a lot of dynamics at play here. There is, of course, the internal pressure that he has put on his administration to get a deal that would prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon that is better than what the Obama administration had negotiated previously, the so-called JCPOA that Trump had pulled the U.S. out of in his first term. Now, critics, of course, say that this pressure that you talked about, this pressure to get a deal quickly, might mean that Trump might acquiesce to a deal that puts that objective at a status quo, at a situation where we were close to the status quo or even worse than the status quo than before the war started. Now, a deal that would also leave the thorniest issues for resolution at a later date would also expose Trump to a lot of criticism because of the fear that Iran might be able to exploit any ambiguity in the language of a text. But perhaps the biggest dynamic at play here is the widespread dissatisfaction among Americans because of how this war has impacted their lives. It, of course, has sent energy prices soaring, which, of course, has led to an increase in overall household spending. I cannot underscore enough just how unpopular this war is among everyday Americans. It is what they will tell you whenever you meet any given one on the street.
Can you talk with us a little bit about, how those priorities rank among Americans? What do they want most coming out of this war? Is it really all about taming energy prices, which have shot up since the beginning of the war, or do they also have expectations regarding Iran's nuclear program and other issues?
Predominantly, yes. For the average American, of course, it would be about how this war has affected himself or his family personally. As such, taming energy prices would be a big personal priority for many Americans. But there is some polling to suggest that they do have some thoughts on Iran acquiring a nuclear weapon as well. So there is a Fox News poll from the middle of May that showed just 39% of registered voters want U.S. military operations to last however long it should last until the U.S. Achieves its objectives, while 61% preferred a limited time frame, as in they want the U.S. out of there sooner rather than later. So a New York Times Asiana poll showed 52% of voters said that the U.S. should get out of military operations even if they can't reach a deal with Iran on its nuclear program. So, numbers like that do show us that Americans do have thoughts on Iran's nuclear program, but what these polls aren't showing is a lot of confidence on whether Trump and his administration are in a position to achieve that particular objective there.
Janelle Dumalaon. Thank you, Janelle.
Well, joining me now is Andrew Gawthorpe. He is a specialist in U.S. politics and foreign policy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. He's also the writer and host of America Explained. His work looks closely at how American power is used abroad, especially in the Trump era. Mr. Gawthorpe, it's good to have you with us. You heard it there at the beginning of this program. There are conflicting reports about what may or may not be in a possible peace agreement. Do you understand what's happening right now? Can you see through the fog of war?
Well, Brent, thanks for having me. And I think that the surest thing we can say right now is that at this moment at 7 p.m. on Wednesday here in Europe, both sides don't want to go back to war. They want to keep talking. They want to try to string out this process so that they don't start a new round of escalation that could be very damaging for both sides. But it seems that the more they talk and the more that we hear about what they're talking about, the less it becomes clear that there's a path forward for them to find a deal that they can both agree on. Both of them, as you said in your introduction, are carrying out this war of words against one another and accusing the other of lying about what they've been talking about, what's been agreed to. And when we do hear reporting from inside both governments, it seems that they're still very far apart on the main points of contention here. So they don't want to fight. They also can't find a diplomatic solution.
Iran's leadership says that the latest U.S. strikes from this week prove that Washington cannot be trusted. They're saying that the U.S. has acted in bad faith. And yet Iran has not walked away from these talks. What does that tell you?
I think that tells us that Iran does fear the re-escalation of this conflict, and also that it believes that time is on its side. Iran has established this chokehold over the Strait of Hormuz that gives it the ability to do great damage to the American economy, to the global economy. And the Iranian leadership think that if they can keep that in place for a long time, then Trump will become more and more desperate for a deal. I also think it's the case that because Trump has now threatened to escalate the conflict again, to restart the conflict 6 times by my counting, and then not done it even when Iran has blown through his deadlines, I think Trump has, to an extent, lost his deterrence here. Iran realizes that it doesn't have to accede to his maximal demands. It can just keep him talking, keep him hoping. And as they do that, more and more, they believe the American position worsens, and the result will be a better deal for them at the end of the day.
I know that you've written critically about the way these negotiations are being handled, especially if you compare these negotiations to the negotiations that led to the last Iran nuclear deal, which was known as the JCPOA. I mean, back then, there were technical experts, there were inspectors, there was a long negotiating record. What do you see this time around?
Well, what we see this time around is that the negotiation is largely being conducted by political figures who are personally close to Donald Trump. So people like Steve Witkoff and people like Jared Kushner, who are personal envoys of the president. What they do have going for them is that they do speak for Donald Trump. They're very closely connected to him, but they don't have the type of technical or diplomatic expertise that is typically required to put this kind of deal together. The last Iran deal took dozens of people years to negotiate. I also think that another very important factor here is that, strangely, counterintuitively, even though Iran has just been subject to a large military campaign by the United States, American leverage is less this time around than it was back in 2014-15, because now Iran has established this control over the Strait of Hormuz. It's found a new way to pressure the Americans that the White House seems to have no answer to. And paradoxically, that actually seems to put Trump in a much weaker negotiating position than Obama was. So he's trying to get more with less in more difficult circumstances.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the Strait of Hormuz because the current talks, they appear to be about several things at once. There's the Strait of Hormuz, there's frozen Iranian assets, there's sanctions relief, and there's the blockade of Iranian oil ports, and eventually new limits on Iran's nuclear program. I mean, is that a realistic bundle for a fast deal, in your opinion?
It's definitely not. And I think that even the White House is admitting that, because the latest version of a framework deal that they teased was supposedly close to being achieved last weekend was essentially a deal whereby Iran would reopen the Strait of Hormuz, the US would lift some sanctions, and they would kick every other issue down the road. They said 60 days, but I think it would take longer than that as well. So there's starting to be a realization in Washington that you can't do all of this at once. Iran has not been battered to the extent that it's willing to give Trump unconditional surrender, which is what he said he wanted a few months ago. And instead, this is going to be a very long, drawn-out process in which the Iranians get a vote. And because of the leverage that they've established, they are also in a powerful position to dictate the pacing and the content of these talks. And they're definitely in no hurry to give up all of their cards at once. So if a deal does happen, it will take time, it will be partial, and it will not contain the wish list that the White House keeps promising is close to being achieved.
Andrew Gawthorpe, good to have you with us this evening. Good to get your insights on these talks and the situation right now as it stands between the U.S. and Iran. Thank you. And joining me here now in the studio is Arash Azizi. Arash is a historian and lecturer at Yale University. He is the author of several books, including What Iranians Want, Women, Life, Freedom. The book examines what ordinary Iranians are demanding, including accountable government and a normal life free from repression and isolation. Arash, it's good to have you with us. We wanted to talk with you because we know that you're in touch with people inside Iran. What are you hearing from them? I mean, what does this war feel like to the people inside the country?
Being in touch has become a bit easier as the internet is opening up a little bit. It hasn't fully opened up yet, but it's opening up yet. Look, there are obviously many different sentiments. Iran is a country of 90 million. But overall, there is a bit of helplessness. I mean, it's been terrible. The last few months have been terrible. There was a massacre of protesters in January, and then there was followed by war that had killed many civilians and really left the future of the country undecided. And then the economic problems have really bedeviled Iranians the last few years. It already led to the protests in January. But since the war began, it has become, much worse. Things like eating, meat or chicken or, God forbid, fish has become a real luxury for many Iranians. A lot of job losses, more than 1 million jobs have been lost in the last couple of months. So I would say it's a time of uncertainty, a feeling that they're helpless and their future is being decided elsewhere and really difficult economically.
There is a ceasefire that is in effect, and yet this week we saw the U.S. launch attacks on Iranian targets. They said it was self-defense. The regime in Tehran has said they violated the ceasefire and that they acted in bad faith. When the regime, when they communicate and try to set the narrative inside Iran, do they believe what they hear at face value? I mean, or do they not trust the leadership?
Well, I mean, Iranians are pretty savvy. So, I mean, they obviously parse through whatever the regime tells them. And also, they don't believe whatever regime tells them. They don't believe what the United States or Israel tell them either, right? I mean, I think they're dissecting when it comes to that. But I think both sides don't consider the mutual attacks as a lasting violation of ceasefire. In other words, they don't want to return to war. And I think quite to the contrary, I think they're very close to a deal that would end the war.
We hear time and time again that many people inside Iran do not support the Islamic Republic. But we've been told that does not mean that they don't support their country, and they certainly don't support foreign bombs landing on their territory. I mean, how widespread is this dichotomy, if you will?
Well, first of all, there is widespread opposition to the Islamic Republic. I would say 70-80% of people don't like this regime and they'd like it to replace by something else. But they also know and have learned through really bitter experience that, first of all, things could get really worse, like the regime destabilization can also really worse and threaten things. They also know there is no easy sort of alternative. As to their attitudes toward the war, again, there are a wide range of different attitudes. It had also changed. Yes, Iranians generally support their country. It's true that some Iranians really did support the war, especially at the beginning, because they thought it could lead to a political result that they would want. If they thought it could get rid of the regime, why not? But I think through bitter experience, they learned mostly that this was not going to be sort of a walk in the park, and that there would be a lot of damage to Iranian civilians, Iranian lives, a threat to Iranian infrastructure, in fact, Iranian civilization, as President Trump himself threatened.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously that really ruffled many feathers and means that there was very little support.
What do you think people are more afraid of? The war ending with a loss for Iran, or the regime actually feeling that it's been emboldened and it's stronger and repressing the population more? Or what about if there is a decapitation of leadership and there's a vacuum? Maybe what do people fear the most?
I think what they fear the most is, in a way, yes, they are fearful of an emboldened regime that is repressing more, and that's basically what's happening now to a large degree. But I think they also hate the situation of limbo that lasts for long. Again, economics are really important. Sometimes, we don't talk enough about it because, you imagine you are anywhere. Imagine you are a journalist in Iran, or you are someone who works in any sector. You've had years of bad business, months of total, and actually about a year of total uncertainty, because from the June war, we are in the first anniversary almost of the June war. When Iran had a war last year, it came to an inconclusive end. How do you run a business there, and how do you pay your workers? And if you don't pay your workers, how are they going to make a living, right? Yeah. So I think that's really on top of many Iranian minds, and they just would like some return to some stability.
And I know being able to communicate with the outside world, that has been next to impossible with this internet blackout. But we know that is changing. We want to pull up a graphic here. We can see that Iran's internet connectivity is beginning to recover. I think what the graph shows is about 60% of people are able to get on the internet. But it still doesn't change the fact that it's about 6%, I think my producer was telling me. 86%. So what does an internet blackout, what does it do, though, to people psychologically? Especially when they're already living in a society with official repression.
Yeah, I mean, it was very difficult to go through the blackout. Again, it's actually also an economic question because so many businesses in Iran, I would say more than even like an average Western country, were very closely tied to the internet, right? So if you're a therapist, you use online to teach. A lot of teachers and use it. Tutors use it. People use Instagram to sell their products, right? From like, you could be a fisherman who relies on internet to sell your ware, right? Internet is so interwoven into our lives.
Yeah.
For anybody, it would be hard to imagine internet is caught. I should say, though, that the Iranians did find reach-arounds in this way, shortcuts, which were quite expensive. So the other thing that happened was this further classification of Iran society. Now internet became a luxury good that you could only afford if you could buy this, what they call config.
We're not talking about a VPN. We're talking about something totally different, right?
Yeah, it's sort of an advanced level, similar to VPN. They call it config.
Yeah.
But anyways, it just meant that people had to pay a lot of money just to be able to get online. And thankfully now, with the policy pushed for by President Pezeshkian, the internet is being opened.
And with the leadership deciding to end the blackout, from the outside, that looks like you have a regime that is emboldened and that feels confident, so confident, in fact, that it has decided to let people access information freely. I mean, that's actually the opposite of what President Trump wanted to see happen. I mean, do the Iranians, do they see it that way as well, that the regime is actually sitting, firm in the saddle now?
I mean, there's not many other ways to see it in many ways. The regime feels triumphant. The deal that it's about to make with the U.S., frankly, it's getting better terms than it would have before the war, in many ways. It used its long-lasting dream of closure of the Strait of Hormuz, and it showed to the world that, yes, actually, if you close the Strait of Hormuz, we can take the world hostage and we can make concessions out of it. It papered over a succession crisis. They killed Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader. They were appointing in a week. All institutions worked. They appointed his son in his place. So the regime is feeling triumphant. Now, it's going to face a lot of problems economically and otherwise.
Yeah.
It remains very unpopular and all that, but
are you confident that they're unified, that there's no infighting, fighting for ultimate control?
There's little infighting so far, I would say. There is some infighting. There's a fringe, ultra-hardliner segments of the regime represented by people like Saeed Jalili and others that lose their presidential candidate and a member of the National Security Council. But I think, remarkably, most factions of the regime have really come together because they understood that they need to come together at times of war. And I would say even sections of the opposition, frankly, they haven't sort of supported the regime, but they show at least some sympathy for it.
I was going to ask you, I mean, is there an opposition to speak of right now inside the country? And also, what about Reza Pahlavi, the son of the last Shah of Iran? I mean, what role does he play, if any, inside the country?
So, to start from inside the country, yes, there is an opposition. It's not organized, but there are many figures like Mustafa Tajzadeh, former cabinet minister, Narges Mohammadi, Nobel Peace Laureate, who's really being mistreated in prison, and many others. Abdullah Momeni, student leader. These are important opposition figures inside the country who continue fighting for democracy. Yeah. I think they would be happy, most of them, to see an end to the war. But then, nevertheless, of course, they continue the campaigns for democracy and for democratic transition, which is what they've called for. As for Mr. Pahlavi, he had many supporters inside. If you asked me this question a few months ago, he had many supporters inside Iran. He continues to have some of them. But his policy of supporting the war, I think, has backfired. He supported the war in which many Iranian civilians were killed. He did not issue a single, condolence message, even when they killed more than 200 student girls and boys, mostly girls, I think, in a school in Iran the first day of the war. And politically, he looks pretty hapless, right? His support is unorganized. He has not been able to, show that he can politically do anything to bring about what he claims he wants, which is a transition led by him. Politics is not a place of words, it's a place of action. Yeah. And in the last few months, in this moment of truth, Pahlavi has been found wanting. So I don't think he has a bright political future.
There's been so much that has happened in the 3 months since this war started. And if we go back and look, the closing of the Strait of Hormuz has become a serious weapon, if you will, for Iran that really didn't exist before this war. the Iranians have not turned over any enriched uranium. There has not been a regime change the way that there was talk about it before this war began. If you look at all of this together, it looks like, no matter what kind of peace deal there is, that Iran has won this war.
I mean, I think this will become a unmistakable conclusion. There are some great articles in the Atlantic by some of my colleagues on the same topic, and it's very interesting the way they look at it.
Is that how you see it?
Well, I mean, I think it's hard to say, perhaps, and the question of who won. But it's hard not to see, and the wars have different ways of determining that, right? Mm-hmm. Sometimes history belongs to military historians. My colleagues in the other part of my life, academia, military historians, I think, have some criteria, right? Mm-hmm. Technical criteria, and sometimes a victory can mean different things. But it's hard, and we have to see how the war ends. It hasn't ended yet, right?
Correct.
Even though we're close to it ending. But it's hard not to see that the Islamic Republic really did. If the goals of the war was a regime change, obviously it failed. If the goals of the war was weakening of Iran's sort of military capabilities, it's not clear whether this is. It's unlikely for this weakening to be lasting. Mm-hmm. So in this way, Iran certainly hasn't lost. And if you don't lose a war you didn't start, you kind of win, right?
That's what they say on both sides of the Atlantic. Arash, Azizi, good to have you in the studio. We appreciate you taking the time to come in today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.